The courtroom was silent long before the judge entered. Television crews had filled the back rows. Reporters whispered into microphones, convinced they were covering another open-and-shut murder case. Outside, dozens of people held signs demanding justice for the victim. Inside, one man sat alone at the defense table, wearing a navy suit that no longer fit after months in county jail. His name was Daniel Brooks, a respected high school history teacher with no criminal record, no history of violence, and 20 years of service in his community. Yet that morning, nearly everyone in the courtroom believed they were looking at a murderer. The prosecution's opening statement lasted less than 20 minutes, but it sounded devastating. A neighbor claimed to have seen Daniel leaving the victim's house shortly before the body was discovered. Phone records appeared to place him near the crime scene. Investigators testified that Daniel had argued with the victim only days before the murder. Each piece of evidence seemed to fit perfectly, forming a story that looked impossible to challenge. By the time the prosecutor returned to his seat, several jurors were already taking notes with serious expressions. The case felt almost decided before the defense had spoken a single word. Among the 12 jurors sat Sarah Collins, a quiet accountant in her early 40s. She had answered every question honestly during jury selection, or at least that was what everyone believed. As Daniel briefly looked toward the jury box, his eyes stopped for less than a second. Sarah immediately looked away. Her heart began racing. She recognized him instantly. More than 15 years earlier, they had volunteered together at a local youth education program. They had spoken dozens of times, attended community events together, and even appeared in a newspaper photograph celebrating student volunteers. Daniel didn't seem to recognize her anymore, but Sarah knew exactly who he was. The judge had asked every juror a simple question before the trial began. "Do you know the defendant in any personal or professional capacity?" Sarah had quietly answered, "No." It was only one word, one small lie. But that answer allowed her to remain on the jury that would decide Daniel's future. At first, she convinced herself it didn't matter. 15 years was a long time. They had never been close friends. She believed she could still be fair. But with every witness who took the stand, every photograph shown on the courtroom screen, and every accusation repeated by the prosecution, the weight of that single lie grew heavier. She wasn't just listening to evidence anymore. She was judging someone whose past she partially knew, someone the court believed was a complete stranger. As the first day of testimony ended, the cameras outside declared that the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. Headlines predicted a quick conviction. Viewers across the country were told that justice was only days away. No one realized that the most important secret in the courtroom wasn't hidden in an evidence box. It was sitting quietly in the third seat of the jury box. The second morning of the trial began with an air of certainty. Television commentators outside the courthouse were already predicting a guilty verdict before the jury had even taken their seats. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors looked confident. They believed today's witnesses would remove any remaining doubt from the jurors' minds. Daniel Brooks sat quietly beside his attorney, his hands folded together, watching as the courtroom doors opened and the first witness walked toward the stand. The prosecution's star witness was Michael Harper, the victim's next-door neighbor. Calm, confident, and convincing, Michael testified that he had seen Daniel leaving the victim's house shortly before the estimated time of death. According to his account, Daniel appeared nervous, looked over his shoulder several times, and drove away quickly in a dark blue sedan. The prosecutor asked only a handful of questions before turning toward the jury, allowing the silence to reinforce the impact of the testimony. Several jurors nodded while writing notes. It seemed like the strongest eyewitness account in the entire case. On the surface, Michael's story was simple. Too simple. When the defense attorney, Rebecca Collins, rose for cross-examination, her voice remained calm and respectful. She didn't accuse the witness of lying. Instead, she began asking small, ordinary questions that seemed unrelated to the murder. How far was your front porch from the victim's driveway? What was the weather like that evening? Which streetlights were working? How long did you actually see the driver? Michael answered each question confidently, unaware that Rebecca wasn't challenging his memory. She was quietly testing its limits. Then she displayed a weather report collected from the National Weather Service. Heavy rain had reduced visibility throughout the neighborhood during the exact time Michael claimed to recognize Daniel from nearly 70 feet away. Moments later, she presented city maintenance records, showing that 2 of the 3 streetlights on that block had been out of service for nearly a week before the murder. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Michael hesitated for the first time. Rebecca asked one final question. "Mr. Harper, if the street was nearly dark and heavy rain reduced visibility, are you certain you identified the driver by his face? Or are you assuming it was Daniel because investigators later showed you his photograph? The witness paused. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but inside the courtroom it felt much longer. I believed it was him, Michael finally replied. I can't honestly say I clearly saw his face. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters immediately began writing new notes. For the first time since the trial had started, the prosecution's timeline no longer looked perfect. Their strongest eyewitness had just admitted that certainty and assumption were not the same thing. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even reasonable doubt yet. But it was the first crack in the wall that had been built around him. Across the jury box, Sarah Collins gripped her notebook more tightly. Every answer she heard made her feel increasingly uneasy. She remembered the kind, patient volunteer Daniel had once been years ago, helping teenagers prepare for college entrance exams. She also remembered the oath she had taken as a juror, to remain impartial and truthful. Her hidden connection to Daniel was becoming harder to ignore. As court adjourned for lunch, the prosecution still appeared confident. They believed digital evidence would erase the uncertainty created by the eyewitness. Phone location records, they promised, would place Daniel exactly where the murder occurred. No one realized that those records contained a small inconsistency, one that would eventually lead investigators toward a forgotten photograph, a hidden conflict of interest, and a truth the jury had never been allowed to hear. When the jury returned from lunch, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed. The prosecution had lost some momentum after the eyewitness admitted he couldn't be completely certain of what he had seen. But they weren't concerned. They had saved what they believed was their strongest evidence for the afternoon. Digital evidence. Unlike eyewitnesses, computers didn't forget. At least, that was the argument the prosecution wanted the jury to believe. The lead digital forensic investigator walked confidently to the witness stand carrying several binders and a hard drive containing months of extracted phone data. Behind him, a massive courtroom screen illuminated with maps, timestamps, and colorful location markers. To the jury, it looked scientific, precise, impossible to dispute. The prosecutor pointed toward the display. "Can you tell the jury what these records show?" The investigator nodded. According to the defendant's cellular location history, his phone remained within approximately 300 feet of the victim's residence at 8:43 p.m., the estimated time of death. A red dot appeared on the digital map. Then another. Then another. The dots barely moved. The visual presentation was powerful. Several jurors leaned forward. One reporter quietly whispered, "This could decide the case." Daniel stared at the screen without saying a word. His attorney, Rebecca Collins, didn't look at the map. She looked at the timestamps. Every single one of them. For nearly 20 minutes, the prosecution walked the jury through the digital timeline. They explained how cell towers worked, how mobile devices communicated with nearby antennas, and why the location records supposedly proved Daniel never left the neighborhood. When the presentation ended, the courtroom felt heavy. Even Sarah Collins, sitting in the jury box, found herself wondering if she had been wrong all along. Maybe Daniel wasn't the person she remembered. Maybe people really did change. Maybe. Rebecca slowly stood. She carried only a thin folder. No dramatic graphics. No complicated presentation. Just a single sheet of paper. "Investigator," she began calmly, "when your team extracted these phone records, did you also preserve the device's internal system logs?" The investigator hesitated. "Those logs weren't necessary." Rebecca nodded politely. "So the answer is no?" "Correct." A quiet silence settled over the courtroom. Rebecca walked toward the evidence screen. "Would you agree that cellular tower connections estimate location, but do not always identify the exact position of a person?" "Generally speaking, yes." "And would you also agree that network congestion, signal routing, maintenance activity, and tower overlap can affect those estimates?" "In certain situations, yes." Rebecca turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has repeatedly described this evidence as exact." She paused. The investigator just confirmed, "It isn't." The prosecutor immediately objected, mischaracterizing the testimony. The judge allowed Rebecca to continue. She reached into her folder. "Your Honor, yesterday evening the defense received additional technical records from the cellular carrier after a delayed preservation request." The courtroom became completely silent. These records include engineering maintenance logs that were never reviewed during the original investigation. Even the prosecutor looked surprised. Rebecca placed the document on the evidence screen. Across the top were 4 words: Cell Tower Maintenance Report. The highlighted section showed something unexpected. One of the 3 nearby towers had been operating in emergency maintenance mode during the exact hour prosecutors claimed Daniel's phone location was precise. The investigator slowly adjusted his glasses. He looked at the report, then back at the prosecutor, then back at the report again. Rebecca asked one final question. If one of the primary towers was operating under maintenance conditions, can you still tell this jury, under oath, that these location estimates are accurate to the degree you originally claimed? For the first time since taking the witness stand, the investigator didn't answer immediately. The silence inside the courtroom became almost unbearable. Finally, he lowered his head. No, I cannot say that with certainty. A ripple of whispers spread across the gallery. The prosecution's strongest piece of evidence had just become uncertain. Across the jury box, Sarah Collins felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't only questioning the evidence anymore. She was questioning whether her own silence had helped place an innocent man on trial. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had spent 2 days describing the case as overwhelming suddenly changed their headlines. Because the trial had just entered a completely different chapter. But no one, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even Daniel's attorney, knew that the most explosive evidence was still hidden. It wasn't inside a phone. It wasn't inside a police report. It was locked away inside an old storage box, alongside a forgotten photograph that had been ignored for almost 16 years. The following morning, the courthouse was noticeably more crowded than before. Overnight, national news outlets had changed their tone. What had once been described as an open-and-shut murder trial was now being called a case filled with growing uncertainty. Reporters who had confidently predicted a conviction only 2 days earlier were now asking a different question. Had investigators overlooked something that could change everything? Daniel Brooks entered the courtroom looking exhausted. Weeks of headlines had already damaged his reputation beyond repair. Parents had removed their children from his history classes. Friends had stopped returning his calls. His teaching license had been suspended, pending the outcome of the trial. Even if he walked free, the life he had built over 20 years might never fully return. Across the courtroom, Sarah Collins couldn't stop thinking about the single answer she had given during jury selection. No. One word. One secret. One decision that now felt impossible to justify. The defense called an unexpected witness. Not a detective. Not a forensic scientist. Not another eyewitness. Instead, an elderly retired school principal slowly approached the witness stand carrying a worn cardboard archive box. His name was Robert Evans, and for more than 30 years he had organized community education programs throughout the county. The box contained hundreds of old photographs, newspaper clippings, volunteer records, and event schedules that had been stored in the basement of a closed school building for nearly 2 decades. At first, the prosecution looked almost amused. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "I'm struggling to understand how old community photographs are relevant to a murder trial." Rebecca Collins simply replied, "Because sometimes the smallest piece of forgotten history reveals the biggest conflict in the present." She carefully removed a large photograph from a protective folder and placed it on the courtroom display screen. The image showed a community literacy event held 16 years earlier. Dozens of volunteers stood together, smiling toward the camera. Children filled the front row. Teachers stood along the sides. Near the center of the photograph stood a much younger Daniel Brooks. Only 2 people away stood Sarah Collins. The courtroom became completely silent. Sarah's face lost all color. Rebecca didn't speak immediately. She allowed the jury and the judge to study the image for themselves. Then she asked Robert Evans a simple question. "Do you recognize the individuals in this photograph?" "Yes," he answered confidently. "I organized this event. They volunteered together for almost 2 years." Rebecca nodded. "Would you describe them as strangers?" Robert looked at the photograph again. "No. They worked together regularly. Everyone on that volunteer team knew one another." For several long seconds, no one moved. The judge slowly turned toward the jury box. His eyes settled on Sarah Collins. "Juror number 7. His voice was calm, but unmistakably serious. "Would you please stand?" Sarah rose slowly. Her hands were trembling. The judge asked the question everyone in the courtroom already knew the answer to. "Did you know the defendant before this trial?" Sarah closed her eyes. There was no escape anymore. "Yes. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I did." A wave of astonishment swept through the courtroom. Reporters rushed toward the hallway doors to file breaking updates. The prosecutor stared in disbelief. Daniel looked at Sarah for the first time since the trial began. Not with anger, but with confusion. He genuinely hadn't recognized her after all these years. The judge immediately dismissed the jury from the courtroom. Within minutes, attorneys from both sides were called into an emergency hearing. The trial had stopped. Not because of DNA. Not because of fingerprints. Not because of digital evidence. But because one juror had concealed a relationship that the court had specifically asked about before the trial ever began. As Sarah sat alone in a private jury room, she quietly admitted what she had been trying to convince herself wasn't important. She hadn't hidden the truth because she wanted Daniel convicted. She had hidden it because she believed it wouldn't matter. Now she realized that one decision had placed the fairness of the entire trial in jeopardy. But as investigators began reviewing how this conflict had gone unnoticed, they discovered something even more disturbing. The prosecution had received a copy of that same volunteer photograph during pretrial evidence review. No one had ever added it to the court file. No one had asked why. No one had investigated further. The question was no longer whether the trial had been compromised. The question had become, the courtroom remained empty for nearly 2 days. Instead of hearing witnesses, the judge ordered an emergency evidentiary review. News helicopters circled above the courthouse while reporters camped outside, sensing that this case had become far bigger than a single murder trial. What had begun as a straightforward prosecution was now raising uncomfortable questions about the integrity of the justice system itself. Inside the prosecutor's office, dozens of investigators began reviewing thousands of digital files connected to the case. Emails, evidence logs, witness disclosures, and internal communications were copied onto secure forensic drives. Every document was being examined, not to determine whether Daniel Brooks was guilty, but to answer a far more troubling question. How had a juror's connection to the defendant gone completely unnoticed? Rebecca Collins wasn't looking for dramatic evidence. She was looking for routine paperwork. In her experience, major mistakes were rarely hidden inside spectacular conspiracies. They were buried beneath ordinary administrative records that everyone assumed someone else had already reviewed. Late that evening, while comparing evidence disclosure lists against archived email folders, one junior investigator noticed something unusual. An attachment had been opened, but never officially logged into the court record. The subject line was simple: Community Volunteer Archive. The email had been sent nearly 8 months before the trial. Attached to it was the very same photograph that had stopped the proceedings. Rebecca asked the investigator to trace every recipient. The email had been delivered to 3 offices: the district attorney's office, the lead detective, and the prosecution's evidence coordinator. The courtroom became silent again the following morning as Rebecca presented the discovery before the judge. She didn't accuse anyone of misconduct. She simply displayed the email on the courtroom monitor. The timestamp, the recipient list, the attachment. Every detail was authentic. The prosecutor slowly stood. His expression had completely changed. He quietly admitted that he had never personally seen the email. According to office procedure, incoming evidence was first reviewed by an evidence coordinator before being forwarded to trial attorneys. The judge immediately ordered that coordinator to testify. An hour later, Linda Chavez walked into the courtroom. She had spent 14 years managing digital evidence for the district attorney's office. She appeared nervous long before taking the witness stand. Rebecca asked only one question: "Did you receive this email?" Linda looked at the screen. "Yes." "Did you review the attached photograph?" "Yes." "Did you realize one of the jurors appeared in that photograph alongside the defendant?" Linda remained silent. Rebecca repeated the question. Finally, Linda nodded. "Yes." A quiet gasp spread through the gallery. The judge leaned forward. "Then why wasn't the court informed?" Linda swallowed hard before answering. "Because I assumed it wasn't important." The courtroom froze. She explained that the volunteer program had ended more than 15 years earlier. She believed the relationship was too distant to matter. She marked the email as administrative background material instead of potential evidence. No prosecutor ever reviewed it. No defense attorney received it. No judge knew it existed. One administrative decision, made in less than 30 seconds, had allowed a juror with a prior relationship to remain on the panel deciding Daniel Brooks' future. The judge slowly removed his glasses. For nearly half a minute, no one spoke. Finally, he looked toward both legal teams. This court is no longer examining only the murder charge. This court is now examining whether the defendant ever received a fair trial at all. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time since his arrest, he wasn't thinking about prison. He was thinking about something even more painful. If this photograph had been disclosed from the beginning, would he have ever spent a single day in jail? Outside the courthouse, television networks interrupted their programming with breaking news. The story was no longer about an accused killer. It had become a story about a justice system confronting its own mistakes. But the judge wasn't finished. As forensic specialists continued reviewing the prosecution's digital evidence, they uncovered another anomaly. This one had nothing to do with photographs, nothing to do with jurors, nothing to do with eyewitnesses. It involved the victim's home security system, a system investigators believed had failed on the night of the murder. According to newly recovered maintenance logs, the cameras hadn't failed at all. They had recorded someone entering the house, someone whose face had never appeared anywhere in the investigation. The courthouse was unusually quiet on the 6th morning of the hearing. Gone were the confident predictions. Gone were the headlines declaring Daniel Brooks guilty before the trial had even reached its conclusion. Now every reporter waiting outside asked the same question. If the investigation missed this much, what else did they miss? Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered without speaking. The atmosphere felt different. No one was discussing theories anymore. Today was about evidence. Evidence that had remained hidden for nearly 3 years. Daniel Brooks sat silently beside Rebecca Collins. He had stopped trying to guess what would happen next. Every day of the trial had rewritten the previous day's conclusions. Hope had become something dangerous, because every time he allowed himself to believe freedom was possible, another accusation followed. Rebecca leaned toward him. Whatever happens today, we finally have something that can't forget, can't exaggerate, and can't be pressured. Daniel nodded. The cameras. Rebecca answered quietly. If they really recorded that night, they'll tell us exactly who walked through that front door. The courtroom lights dimmed. A large monitor descended from the ceiling. The prosecution looked uneasy. For months they had insisted the home's security cameras failed because of a power interruption. According to the original investigation, no usable footage existed. That conclusion had never been questioned, until a forensic video specialist examined the recorder itself. Instead of a hardware failure, he found something unexpected. The recorder had automatically created an encrypted backup, not inside the house, but inside the manufacturer's cloud recovery system. No investigator had ever requested it. The courtroom watched in complete silence as the forensic specialist connected a secure drive. The timestamp appeared first. October 18th, 8:37 p.m. Static filled the screen. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, the front porch camera activated. Rain poured across the driveway. Leaves moved violently in the wind. The victim's front door remained closed. Seconds later, a dark SUV entered the frame. It wasn't Daniel's blue sedan. It wasn't even the same model of vehicle investigators had described throughout the trial. The SUV stopped briefly. A person wearing a dark hood stepped out. Their face couldn't be seen. They walked directly toward the front entrance. The timestamp read, 8:41 p.m. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Rebecca pressed pause. She looked toward the lead detective. Detective, did your investigation ever identify this vehicle? The detective slowly answered. No, because we believe the cameras failed before this recording. Rebecca nodded. So the jury never saw this footage? Correct. The prosecution never disclosed it, because they never knew it existed. Correct. The judge leaned forward. Continue the recording. The video resumed. Exactly 4 minutes later, the same hooded figure rushed back toward the SUV. But this time, something was different. The person was carrying a small black duffel bag. They entered the driver's seat. The vehicle disappeared into the rain. The timestamp ended at 8:46 p.m. No one spoke. Even the courtroom reporters had stopped typing. Rebecca walked toward the evidence screen. She placed Daniel's verified phone timeline beside the recovered security footage. According to independent GPS records, Daniel was nearly 6 miles away, attending a parent-teacher conference that ended at 8:44 p.m. The timelines could not exist together. If Daniel's verified location records were accurate, He physically could not have been standing outside the victim's home at 8:41 p.m. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor stood without asking a question. Instead, he quietly addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state requests an immediate recess." The judge looked directly at him. "On what grounds?" The prosecutor took a deep breath. "Because this evidence materially changes the prosecution's theory of the case." Outside the courthouse, breaking news alerts appeared across the country. Newly recovered video raises serious questions in Brooks' murder trial. Within minutes, legal analysts began discussing the possibility of a mistrial. Families of both the victim and Daniel Brooks watched the developments unfold live on television. Neither family celebrated. Neither family spoke. Both understood the same painful truth. If the wrong man had been accused, then the real killer had remained free all this time. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore slowly looked across the room. This court has reached a point where certainty no longer exists. From this moment forward, our responsibility is not to defend previous conclusions. It is to find the truth. Daniel closed his eyes, not because he believed he had won, but because, for the first time in 3 years, someone inside that courtroom had finally said the words he had been waiting to hear. The truth mattered more than the verdict. By sunrise the next morning, the case had become the country's biggest legal story. News anchors were no longer asking whether Daniel Brooks was guilty. They were asking a far more uncomfortable question. How had investigators overlooked evidence that could have changed the entire case? Inside police headquarters, detectives reopened dozens of evidence boxes that had remained untouched since Daniel's arrest. Dust-covered folders were carried into conference rooms. Hard drives were reconnected. Every interview, every surveillance report, and every witness statement was reviewed from the beginning. This time, investigators weren't trying to prove Daniel Brooks was guilty. They were trying to discover where the investigation had gone wrong. Among hundreds of pages, Detective Lisa Monroe found a single interview report that had been marked "No further action required." It was dated just 3 days after the murder. The interview belonged to Ethan Mercer, a private security contractor. He owned a black SUV, the same model that appeared in the newly recovered security footage. Lisa frowned. She opened the interview transcript. Ethan had admitted driving through the victim's neighborhood that evening. His explanation was simple. "I took a shortcut home after work." Investigators accepted the answer. The interview lasted less than 18 minutes. No search warrant was requested. No GPS records were collected. No forensic examination of the vehicle was ever performed. The report simply ended. Subject eliminated. Rebecca Collins stared silently at the document. On what basis was he eliminated? No one answered. The lead detective searched the case file again. There wasn't a single page explaining the decision. Just a signature and a closed file. Within hours, investigators obtained a warrant to examine Ethan Mercer's SUV. The vehicle had been sold nearly 2 years earlier. Fortunately, the new owner still possessed it. Forensic technicians carefully examined every surface. Most evidence had disappeared with time, but inside the cargo compartment, they discovered something unexpected, hidden beneath the replacement carpet. A tiny trace of dried blood. Not enough to identify a suspect immediately, but enough for modern DNA testing. 3 days later, the laboratory returned its report. The blood belonged to the murder victim. The courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel Brooks slowly lowered his head. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes. Because after 3 years of being called a murderer, someone else was finally connected to the crime. The prosecution immediately requested Ethan Mercer appear before the court. He entered wearing a gray suit. Confident, calm, prepared. He denied everything. He admitted owning the SUV. He admitted driving through the neighborhood. But he insisted he had never entered the victim's house. Then Rebecca asked a question no one expected. "Mr. Mercer, would you explain why your company access card was used to enter the victim's office building 6 days before the murder?" Ethan looked surprised. "I don't remember." Rebecca pressed another button. A security video appeared. The footage showed Ethan entering the building late at night, alone, carrying a black duffel bag, the very same type of bag seen in the recovered security camera footage. The courtroom watched without speaking. Rebecca waited, then quietly asked, "Still don't remember?" Ethan's confidence disappeared. The judge ordered a brief recess. During that break, Federal investigators reviewing Ethan's financial records discovered something even more disturbing. Only 2 weeks before the murder, he had received several unexplained wire transfers totaling nearly $480,000. The payments came through multiple shell companies. No legitimate business contracts existed. No invoices. No explanation. Only money. Large amounts of it. When court resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. For the first time since Daniel Brooks had been arrested, the prosecution withdrew its request to continue pursuing a conviction against him. Instead, the prosecutor stood slowly, faced the judge, and said words that no one in the courtroom ever expected to hear. "Your Honor, based upon the newly discovered evidence, the state can no longer argue in good faith that Daniel Brooks is responsible for this murder." A wave of emotion swept across the courtroom. Daniel didn't move. He simply stared forward. 3 years of accusations. 3 years of headlines. 3 years of believing no one would ever listen. And now, the very people who had prosecuted him were admitting the case had fallen apart. But the biggest question still remained unanswered. If Ethan Mercer wasn't acting alone, who had paid him? And why had the victim become a target in the first place? The courtroom was filled long before the hearing began. Every seat was occupied. Reporters stood along the walls with notebooks in hand, waiting for a decision that had already become one of the most controversial cases in recent memory. Outside, satellite trucks lined the streets. Millions of people watched the proceedings live, not because they expected another dramatic twist, but because they wanted to see whether the justice system could admit it had made a terrible mistake. Daniel Brooks sat quietly beside Rebecca Collins. He wasn't thinking about freedom anymore. He was thinking about everything freedom could never return. 3 birthdays missed. 3 Christmas mornings spent inside a concrete cell. 3 years without teaching the students who once filled his classroom with laughter. 3 years during which his elderly father passed away before Daniel was ever allowed to say goodbye. Some losses could never be appealed. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered the courtroom carrying a thick folder. Unlike every previous hearing, she spoke slowly, choosing every word with care. "This court has reviewed the newly discovered evidence, including the recovered surveillance footage, previously undisclosed digital records, the juror conflict that compromised the integrity of these proceedings, and the subsequent forensic findings that fundamentally contradict the prosecution's original theory." She paused. The silence inside the courtroom became almost overwhelming. "The conviction against Daniel Brooks is hereby vacated." Another pause. "The charges are dismissed." For a moment, no one moved. No one applauded. No one spoke. Daniel simply lowered his head. His eyes filled with tears. Rebecca quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. Not because they had won, but because the nightmare had finally ended. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor slowly stood. He looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of this office, I cannot undo the years you lost, but I can acknowledge that our system failed you. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "I don't need revenge. I only wanted someone to believe the truth." Weeks later, authorities completed their investigation into Ethan Mercer. Financial records revealed he had been hired to intimidate the victim during a business dispute involving corporate fraud. The confrontation inside the victim's home turned violent. The murder had never been planned, but once it happened, a rushed investigation focused on the wrong suspect. Every mistake that followed made it harder to uncover the truth. One overlooked email, one undisclosed photograph, one unreliable eyewitness, one misunderstood phone record, one forgotten security backup. Individually, each error seemed small. Together, they nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. Several months later, Daniel returned to the school where he had once taught history. The building looked exactly the same. The hallways still echoed with students' voices. The classrooms still displayed maps and historical timelines. But Daniel wasn't there to teach. He had come to collect the few personal belongings that had remained locked inside his old classroom for 3 years. On his desk sat a dusty cardboard box. Inside was a stack of handwritten letters from former students. Most had been written during the trial. One letter caught his attention. It read, "Mr. Brooks, history taught us that the truth doesn't always win quickly, but we still believe it wins in the end. We hope you come back someday." Daniel folded the letter carefully. For the first time since his arrest, he smiled. not because the past had disappeared, but because the future no longer belonged to the accusation. 1 year later, the state legislature approved a package of judicial reforms inspired by the case. New rules required prosecutors to verify juror conflicts using digital records. Evidence disclosure procedures were strengthened. Independent reviews became mandatory whenever significant digital evidence surfaced after indictment. The reforms couldn't erase what had happened, but they might prevent another innocent person from experiencing the same injustice.